Three. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and dear audience, those who have tuned in today in Conflict and Resilience Research Institute's 14th episode. And we have titled this episode on violence that leads to radicalization and extremism. And today we are very honored and particularly grateful for a young group of students from University of Winnipeg and Manitoba joining us. And we'll be particularly looking forward to listening their ideas on the current situation on extremism and radicalization in global local perspective. Before we start the episode, as a tradition, Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And before I hand over the floor to our esteemed panelist, let me briefly set the context of today's discussion. In setting the context, I'm sure our audience and the panelists as well, uh, we all are aware what is happening around us for last almost a decade. So I'll start my opening statement just giving you an idea what is changing actually. So in the beginning of this decade, we have seen a wave of extremism that was driven from and taking inspiration from Islamic and the religion of Islam and the followers thereon. And it went pretty intense when we saw a drove of foreign fighters joining ISIS in Syria, and there are many Canadian young people joined that bandwagon. But again, from 2013 onward, we have seen a steady decline of ISIS influence all over the world, but it has not totally disappeared from the landscape of our social and political fabric. So the influence is right there, but the activities of Islamic faith-driven extremism has quite a bit of waned. Nonetheless, the foreign fighters, those who have joined and survived, they started coming back to their home countries. And it is particularly important that many of the European nations, including North Americans, we have received the returnee foreign fighters, and we are dealing with different types of circumstances in terms of rehabilitating them into the mainstream society. So after 2016, we see something changing quite, I would say, in a very fast pace after the election in the USA and the change of political landscape. And in that tone, we have noticed that right wing white supremacist movement, or sometimes often dubbed as alt right, alternative right movements, gaining ground. And it has come to a crescendo, I would say, during the pandemic period. And in this whole movement, which is loosely identified as alt right, white supremacist, and right wing extremism, there is hardly any clear identification of the groups. And many of the discussions and ideologies are being exchanged online. And I'm sure our panelists will specifically mention some of these platforms as they are researching on it for some time. And dear audience will be greatly benefited in listening to their insights on these online platforms. Nonetheless, the I would say it has reached a peak during the pandemic period mostly because of very interesting reason. In the pandemic, we have seen the movement which has taken shape after the very sad episode of George Floyd's death into the police hand, and we have seen Black Lives Movement taking very much strong, activities all over the North America, including Winnipeg. So this kind of movement actually laid the anti-government protest, state sentiments to a new height. And so this is kind of thing still we are enduring as we speak today. So this is what actually we see over a past decade has qualitatively changed in the realm of extremism and violence. Particularly speaking of pandemic, and I'm sure our esteemed panelists would be quite elaborately talk about what has been uh, observed in terms of groups movement. But I just want to make a brief comment here that yes, pandemic has quite changed our way of life, way of communication. But as I said or alluded to in the recent past, that all these groups have coalesced into some sort of anti-state movement. Well, within this anti-state movement, a part of these groups also are maintaining their core, belief system, which is very homophobic, anti-Semitic, and of course, anti-immigrant and refugees. So this whole pandemic has given a new dimension to these the definitions and the expression of violence and extremism. And finally, I'd also like to say that the global local connections are still very much alive. And I shall be, I think it's pertinent to quote Counter Extremism Project, CEP, which I closely follow. And in their latest newsletters, they have already published that the global IS and caliphates, these groups have been revived, and they've issued new newsletters, new ideas, and new connections. And this is one of the things that I would like to bring to the attention of our audiences, those who are listening and might be listening in the future, that this global local connection is very important us to understand, those who research in this field, because these connections are it matters, because people outside, they take action based on these connections, they get inspired, they get connected, and they share ideas globally. It's no more local phenomena. And just to give a quick example here, within this time frame, we have seen IS gaining their ground in the South and South Asian countries, especially Bangladesh. And there was a warning just before the festival of Eid, and we saw that Bangladesh police issued a warning to all the diplomatic zones so that the foreigners are safe, and they've taken they took very unprecedented security measures. So what I am pointing out here is that global local connection is very much alive, and I'm sure some of our panelists and observer, they would be able to comment and lay out their insights on this issue. So now let me introduce the group which has volunteered to come here today and share their ideas. This group is called Realize Radicalization. And a very brief background of this group was basically formed out of a class that I taught in University of Winnipeg last fall. And they came together to participate in a global competition organized by a group sponsored by Facebook, based out of United States. And they submitted their project, and that is how this group came together. And they continued their activities after that. They are very much enthusiastic on the topic of radicalization and violence. And dear audience, they're all young people, and we strongly believe that young people have very different perspective of life and the complexity that they go through, and it is important to listen to them. And just for a reason that the young people are the prime victim of recruitment of any extremist group, whether it is right wing or Islamist. So here they are, and I would request all the panelists of Realize Radicalization to have a brief intro. Just share with the audience who you are and what is your interest, what do you do, and then go on to your part of the discussion. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let me introduce the team leader, Mr. Caiden Lee, and he's a second-year political science student at the University of Winnipeg. So, Caiden Lee, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So my name is Caiden Lee. My main interest within radicalization and extremism research has more so been on understanding far-right extremism. kind of more specifically neo-Nazi and white supremacist extremism. And what drew me to this initially was when we were in Kausar's class, we had a Winnipeg Free Press journalist, Ryan Thorpe, come in, and Ryan did a story on a Canadian reservist in Winnipeg who was trying to recruit individuals to join this neo-Nazi group called the Base. And I heard of the story, but I didn't really pay too much attention to it. And after Ryan came and presented to our class, I was absolutely floored. And I thought to myself, how does an individual who comes from small town Manitoba like me adopt these really over the top racist views, especially neo-Nazism, right? And kind of wanted to get to the bottom of how people are driven to adopt those sort of views. So we decided to create this group for the P2P, just kind of based on creating awareness and education on the topic of radicalization, because most Manitobans don't know that this happens. And especially coming from a province where people think that nothing ever really interesting happens here, it was pretty alarming to hear stories like that. So when we started looking more into seeing what makes these individuals join this group, come across these push and pull factors. So these are the factors that basically push the individual towards an extremist group, and then the extremist group pulls them in, right? And so a lot of these are really grievance based. So for example, with the foreign fighters who were leaving Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom to go fight for ISIS in Syria, a lot of their grievances were sort of more spiritual based. So they kind of believed that the West was at war with Islam itself. And as a Muslim, they could not both be Canadian and Muslim. They kind of had to make a choice because they were stuck in this clash of civilizations. But the interesting thing with the far right grievances, I find, is that they're really not spiritual based at all. They're very, very conspiratorial. So I was looking into far right forums and social media platforms and threads last year, just sort of to gain insight on their ideology, their motives, and the language and symbols they use. So they're proponents of this ideology called accelerationism. And basically that's accelerating the collapse of society as soon as possible to establish a white ethnic state. So to get to that point, they advocate for like mass shooting, terrorism. There's been definite attempts. I think if we talk about someone who is pretty famous with that ideology, we'd say Brenton Tarrant in New Zealand, Anders Breivik in Norway. So really scary things. But the one thing I realized pre-COVID was these are really fringe groups. And the people who are more susceptible to sort of picking up these ideologies and these points of views are people who kind of fit the self-isolated, more of a kind of a loner characteristic, right? And so they kind of find these groups on forums on the internet, and you really have to search for them, right? Like you have to actively go to find them, and then you kind of find that community. And the ideology itself is sort of too far gone or over the top really to gain a large following. So to the average individual who might have, kind of far right views, I don't think that they'll pick up these ideas. But now we have COVID, and it seems that COVID is sort of having a massive impact on what the individual might see. And so the government measures with COVID, and COVID itself is sort of being used as a grievance to push people towards extremist organizations. So a fair portion of the individuals in the US at the moment seem to refuse to listen to mainstream media, the CDC, and the WHO. So many believe that COVID itself is this hoax, or it's being used to strip liberties away from the citizens by the government. So we're seeing a massive increase right now in the US in protests by like anti-government organizations. So mostly like far-right militias. They're protesting the lockdowns, mask wearing, and COVID itself, right? So the misinformation surrounding this is sort of becoming this push factor, which is now becoming more susceptible to the average person depending on where they consume their media, right? So this is really evident through seeing factors like the Michigan militia storming the state legislature. You have anti-lockdown protests across America being fueled by like these alternative media sources, groups like QAnonymous, and extremists are starting to sort of take advantage of this pandemic situation right now. So for example, in Missouri, back in March, the FBI foiled a terrorist attack for someone who was planning to bomb a hospital. And then in Las Vegas too, you have extremists who are plotting to exploit tensions between police and Black Lives Matters protests through setting off explosives in an area where there was protesting, hoping to spark violence between the two groups. And out of this has sort of emerged a new group that I wasn't really aware of until this week, but they call themselves the Boogaloo Boys, right? And Boogaloo itself is that term for race war used by these white supremacists. So these people come to these protests. They're heavily armed. They're extremely anti-government. They say they're there to defend the Second Amendment. But the really dangerous thing is they draw out hundreds of far-right protesters of various backgrounds. So the Boogaloo Boys themselves state they're not white supremacists, but it's kind of hard to determine whether or not they aren't, because the term Boogaloo itself is synonymous with the neo-Nazi movement, right? And the Boogaloo Boys themselves talk about how for them it's the potential for a civil war between the government and armed patriots. And a lot of the people who are part of these groups, you can actually see them wearing symbols that are synonymous with the neo-Nazi movement as well, such as like the black sun. And regardless if you have this group or these militias who may not be filled with white supremacists, they could just very well be people who would claim themselves to be patriots or defenders of the Second Amendment. They're still far-right extremists. And I think the largest impact that COVID has had, and especially with the Black Lives Matters protest, is that it sort of brought the threat of far-right extremism in light due to the amount of protests they're going to, and the amount of exposure they're getting. And I think this is really dangerous because it's taking a lot of these militias who might have certain undertones of white supremacist, neo-Nazi, or far-right extremism, and I think it's making it a little more palatable for the average person to see. So before COVID, an individual might see these protests going on in the United States and they might think, well, or not the protests, but might see these groups getting out there, right? And they might say, well, okay, that's a little too far. But now that you have so much misinformation regarding COVID and so much political polarization, I think it's definitely making a lot of these sort of backwards ideologies and extremist points of view seem more normalized. So that's kind of a very dangerous aspect. And COVID-19 itself is now becoming this major grievance creator. It's kind of like what Kausar was talking about. It seems we've hit an apex in the United States, this sort of behavior and these actions from these groups. And we're not completely immune to it in Canada either. I mean, recently we had that individual who stormed, I think it was 24 Sussex Drive, or he stormed the Prime Minister's residence, right? And he himself was a QAnon conspiracy theorist and definitely a far-right individual, or someone who holds extremist views. So kind of in my conclusion with how the pandemic has really affected this is it's kind of emboldened these far-right organizations, and it's kind of, I think, normalized them a bit more and may have given them a bit more legitimacy, not among the mass population, but I think more people are probably willing to support these various groups than you would have before. Because even in the protests, like the armed protests, you see a lot of these people wearing neo-Nazi symbols coming out with weapons. And before the protests, you really would not see that. Like, I don't think they really had the, not the mentality, but the feel that they actually could go out in public wearing those symbols actually, and have a presence. And now that you see that, I think it kind of shows that we're hitting that apex. So kind of my perspective of the situation is that COVID-19 itself has played a huge role in growing this kind of far right sort of extremist point of view. And it's probably working as sort of a recruiting agent for a lot of these groups as well. So that's my piece. Thanks.
Thank you, Caiden. It's a wonderful overview what is happening with regards to these movements. So now I would like to invite Ethan Margolis, and he's also a student of University of Winnipeg, political science, and he will introduce briefly about his interest and who he is. So Ethan, floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for having me. So I decided to join this group with Caiden, and we both began to study these forms and methods of communication in the right-wing, far-right supremacist groups. And by watching documentaries about these groups online, I kind of began to educate myself about the background of where many of these recruits they came from. They came from suburban families like mine and others who are from the typical affluent white community, and they had their own kind of version of radicalization in Europe with fascist ideals, especially in Ukraine, regarding groups like Azov Battalion. And so that piqued my interest about how there was this hidden war that was still going on years after it had gone away from the spotlight, and now it is kind of resurging as this training ground for all these extremists. Now, what has heightened these rise in these groups that I have noticed in the COVID era that we have entered post January 2020, we have found that people are more susceptible to join these groups in their recruiting because of the hardships that already existed for the past decade in the United States and Canada regarding income and racial inequities. And so these inequities are racial for people of color, for employment, and the other for white people would be not to see these and not being educated about these issues. And then with income inequality brought on by COVID, we have mass amount of people unemployed who have not really any purpose because they have been working and now they are unemployed with barely any benefits in the United States, unlike Canada. So we are seeing more of these recruiting drives and runs to be kind of more anti-government and anti-pandemic. So people are demanding to go back to work, but they are still supporting these groups that are advocating for race wars, mass killings. So what we see in this overall is that there is more people susceptible to radical ideas overall. So when there's a large amount of the population that is susceptible to these ideas, I find it is more violence is more likely to occur because of especially the fact that this is a very odd year. Because there's not just only the pandemic, there's also an election, there's also an administration, which is also very anti-science and anti-information and anti-facts, which bodes well for extremist groups to recruit, because when there is someone in power like the president of the United States who is refusing to wear a mask and adhere to his national disease experts' advice, it is very easy for large segments of the population to want to join these groups. Anyhow, that's what I have to say about the whole recruitment drive. Another point that I would also like to talk about is the increased polarization that these groups have created in anticipation for the election, which is coming up. And I think a lot of this COVID has increased the political polarization in the United States for the election, in a sense that what could happen if it is declared to be fraudulent and if the incumbent does not leave, and whether or not these militants could gather around the president and have someone be able to embolden their movement even more in an anti-government sense of view, an anti-establishment, an anti-facts sort of method. Anyhow, I will give it back to Kauser.
Thank you, Ethan, for I would say it's a very important angle that Ethan brought: social polarization and most importantly, inequality. And I think that is a very important and broad subject matter that possibly we all are thinking in today's context. So let us welcome the third speaker today, and he's Mr. Von Zamora, and he's also a student at UFW, and he has very interesting ideas about the whole process So I would request Mr. Vaughan to introduce briefly who you are, what is your interest, and then go into your discussion. Thank you, Mr. Vaughan.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Vaughn. Yeah, I'm a student at UW, part of the Realize Radicalization team, and I was a student with Dr. Ahmed. Um, I joined the Realize Radicalization team because uh, the project sounded really interesting, and there was a lot of important conversations happening with them, and yeah, and so I joined and because I wanted to be part of it. Because I find it is very important, especially now, including this conversation we're having now. It's very important because the time we're in is it's pretty historical. I find it's because there's a lot of things going on, a lot of issues, a lot of around the world, a lot of movements calling for change, um, and to accompany that, there's a lot of uncertainty in the air because we really don't know where all of this is going to lead to eventually. And so it's important to have these conversations. Um, and we find that I found that with this feeling of uncertainty, with this feeling of this increased sense of anxiety and perhaps even fear, especially for those individuals, stakeholders in these issues, that it's it's this type of feeling and social environment that extremist groups rely on when it comes to propagating their ideologies and running their recruitment campaigns. Because as Caiden has said before, that it's 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 this feeling of disenfranchisement and whatnot, this loneliness that extremist groups rely on, and it's those types of people that feel this way that the extremist groups target. And so given this type of social environment and this pressure being applied onto the population, uh, uh, and that extremist groups rely on this type of situation. Uh, the question I find is that how has the COVID-19 pandemic um, exacerbate this situation? Frankly speaking, improve what is already a good opportunity for extremist groups to expand into an even better situation. And so the main point I want to make is in regards to the quarantine and what that has led to, and not to bash on the quarantine or say that it's bad or unnecessary or anything. It's obviously like one of the best things we could do during a pandemic. But there are certain negative things that it has led to, especially in regards to radicalization and terrorism and extremist groups. So the first aspect of this, the quarantine has led to is, and it's pretty self-evident that there's a lot more people on the internet now, because of course less people are working, and everything's just being transitioning online with school and with work, and of course, considering we're in the 21st century, if we're all stuck at home and instead of working and out playing with our friends and whatnot, we're all going to just flock to the internet on our devices. We're going to be scrolling on social media. We're going to be reading up on online forums. We're going to be catching up on the news, play video games, etc. That's what's happening. But consequently, we're also being the potential of us to be exposed to posts from extremist groups increases as well. Facebook is a great example. There's a lot of Facebook pages created by these extremist groups to share their ideologies and to mingle, and also not just formal groups, but also just comments online as well from other posts people are making, and then from there you get all these wars on online and debates that are just so heated and toxic. And we all know what happens, what leads going down that rabbit hole, which is nothing but just a personally heightened sense of like anxiety and perhaps fear and anger and whatnot. So it doesn't lead to anything positive. Um, and and that the other aspect of what else leads what the quarantine has led to is, and Ethan spoke a little bit about this too, is the high spike in unemployment, more people relying on government programs like EI and CERB and pursuing CESB. Uh, Education is affected. Uh, if it's negatively affected, I don't know. I think that's left to be seen as the coming school year approaches. Um, but it's definitely been affected. But also social activities, a lot less of that's happening. Religious activities as well. I attended church with my family a couple of times, and it's very different. You have to book online the mass you're going to attend to, and then yeah, and everyone's separated among the pews. It's very different, and of course, just general lack of exposure to our friends and to our family and the people we care about. Uh, and so that's like worst case scenario is that, let's say you're in another state or another province or perhaps even another country, away from your friends, away from your family. Perhaps you were working, but then you were laid off, so you don't have a job anymore, except you rely on the government. And that perhaps maybe you're also a student, and everything's being transitioned online, and maybe you're not a particularly tech savvy dude. So that's pretty much like worst case scenario in this situation. Uh, uh, but ultimately, what that may lead to is this feeling of disenfranchisement, of just the feeling of like, man, I've lost everything. I don't have my friends. I can't see my family and whatnot. And from there, we could easily see how the extremist groups can can begin targeting these individuals to join their ranks, to support them. Uh, so yeah.
Thank you, Vaughn. I would say it's another interesting angle to think about how these faith movement and things are changing during the pandemic period. Uh, so, dear audience, let me also bring Mr. Ahnaf Tousif Hussain, and he's quite new to Canadian life and Canadian society, I would say. He joined University of Manitoba, and he's a student, but he might have some interesting perspective how this global local dynamics actually work, and with particular reference that I was very much interested in to listening him because of July 1st, 2016 terrorist attack in a upscale holy artisan cafe in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And dear audience, you might be aware that in that incident, the later investigation revealed that there is a Canadian connection. At least two Canadians were involved. One directly because he was involved in planning possibly the attack, and the other was implicated initially, but later on set free. So I was very much interested in understanding what happens in those South Asian countries where IS has already expanded. But anyways, we'll just listen to Mr. Hussain if he can give us some ideas very briefly what changes in that society and how this global local connection works. Mr. Hussain, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Kausar Ahmed. I'm Ahnaf Hussain, like he has already introduced me, and I've lived 20 years, and I was born and brought up in Dhaka, the capital city. And the thing that Caiden was saying, the loner characteristics and backward ideologies, yeah, those are very those are one of the most important factors here. But if I have to talk about this whole extremism or radicalization, it's not a very brief issue. It's a very broad issue. So let me just start where it had all began. So during the partition of Bengal in 1965, there were some people in India uh, specifically some Muslims who believe that this partition was on the basis of the religion, the two nation theory that we already know. Yes, it was basically divided like that. Hindustan, that is India, the land of the Hindus, as we go for the dictionary meaning. And if it and the other one, Pakistan, it means the divine land, the land where everything is that it's totally divine and heavenly. But it didn't turn out to be so heavenly later on, because people from the other Pakistan, they were a bit more practicing Muslims, shall I say, from the positive point of view. But later on, what really happened that their point of view and our point of view that led to a war due to some. We said that we have to maintain our culture, but they said that it's going totally against Islam. Now this is where things get totally dirtier. So there were some people from the Indian part who just came here with a view to enjoy a Muslim country and everything that is related to a perfect country that will have all those Islamic facilities. But after all, we had 71 war, and there were some people who kind of like betrayed due to this. They thought that they're betraying, but they're still not betraying with their religion. Especially in those South Asian societies, people are in their very childhood. They believe in so much of superstitions, like Dr. Kausar Ahmed, and we all were we all have seen all those things. Like even today, my mom, she's a gynecologist, but she's whenever I tell her that why do you believe in this and why do you believe in that, she said that just it's it's because I've been carrying what my parents have been telling me, and they've been carrying it, and it has been become a part of the legacy. But the thing is that sometimes those legacy might turn to extremism and ultimately radicalism, which might turn the shape of terrorism that we fear the most today. So, what happened? Especially, let me take you directly to that day onward, where everything just happened in Holy Artisan, a Spanish bakery in a very diplomatic region in the country. So, the two Canadians who were directly or indirectly affiliated or related to the whole incident, one of them was a very close senior of mine in my high school. I studied in South Beach, and it's a very good English medium where I got most of my lessons. So it was we both just had to practice for a volleyball team, and that is where I got to know about Hamid Bhai. Currently, he is graduate from the U of T, and he's a citizen now. But to be very honest, I've never seen such a polite guy who would do such things. And even today, I don't believe that he was really affiliated. He just said that he was a victim, and I truly believe he was a victim. And the other guy, Tamim Ahmed, he was directly affiliated, who was later on uh, killed by the elite force of Bangladesh Rapid Action Battalion, or shall I say the RAB, and direct crossfire. So what happened that day? We all know 22 foreigners were killed, and they basically targeted the foreigners so that Bangladesh gets a total view as a terrorism-stricken country, but it is not. The thing is that as we go towards more to the countryside, people are more into like they fear the religion. They don't understand the religion. They believe anything what their preachers say, but their preachers they're also human. They're fallible too, right? So what really happened after that? When they believe them, they believe all those superstitions. And I've been a practicing religion since a very early age. I pray every day, but the religion this isn't like that. They make things really complicated to follow and make things really complex. So I would just say that just don't go to any extremism. If you are a practicing Muslim or if you're practicing your religion, just go and do some research work and just look for yourself that is it really that hard to follow. Even our beloved Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he also said that do not go to any extremism in terms of religion. Previously, there were some races that have become totally extinct due to all those waging wars and going after conflicts. Just follow the path of peace, if you don't find anyone following your religion, or after preaching you find that it wasn't up to the mark, just look, give it aside. Don't worry about it. But let me talk about the extremism, how the things totally take shape in Bangladesh. We were made to believe every sort of the superstitions. We were told some mythological stories that this happened like this, which basically doesn't have any logics. But later on, as we just grow up, we have to carry all these within us. But if we don't follow them, the whole society turns up against us, mostly the ones who are in the rural sites. But later on, what really happens, and if you do, and if you just like justify it, they're just more likely to call you that you're not a practicing one. But people there, if you are educated enough, if you truly love the path of peace, just follow. And if you want to become a practicing one and a true Muslim, as a Muslim, I'm just gonna say that nothing is really hard. You don't have to go to any sort of extremism. Extremism, it does not have any religion. It doesn't have any country. It doesn't belong to a fixed boundaries. And I always say that if you wanna just uh, give access to everyone, things become really easy. But due to these uh, fixed communities, we haven't been able to open boundaries to everyone. Ultimately, everyone has become a victim of, like, we don't give access to everyone. The United States, they have already closed borders to everyone. And what I'm just shaping up things really quick is that in a few days, I got a call from one of my friends who was believing everything without any logic. I told him that are these things are really coming to your mind from your just from your mind, or are this just a consequence of the COVID? He just said that, man, you're not. I think you're not following everything truly. I said that I'm just doing what I'm just doing everything right after justifying, and I have been a victim of all this. Let me take you like in 2012. I sat for an admission test. I had all the views to get admitted there in a military school, which is a very good, which is a very reputed one. Even Dr. Kausar Ahmed, his student of that military school. So when I couldn't pass the admission test, I was so kind of depressed, and I didn't. I thought that I'm just gonna give up my studies. I'm not worth of anything, and that is the very thing that I did wrong. I shouldn't have been depressed. So I became a loner at that time, and I used to believe whoever gave me some kind of sympathy. So what really happened? That at that time I used to get all those religious teachings from a preacher, but that is the very thing that I did very wrong. He said that if you're a Muslim, you gotta support a political party that just follows every kind of Islamic laws, and you're not gonna become an atheist. I said okay. I just accepted that without justifying. But later on, I looked and I researched that is there some kind of obligation? Is there a binding that I have to follow an Islamic country? I gotta support it. I found that the guy, he was totally lying, and it was due to his own benefits. They were trying to get a very good attention of the world, and basically, these people are more like sociopaths. They try to they're gonna brainwash you with all those soft and carefully chosen words that you're more kind of like you're gonna believe everything whatever they say. But in the very end, I was I'm gonna say that I'm very fortunate that my parents and my relatives, everyone, they kind of like they told me the whole motive that they had. They were trying to recruit me as a terrorist, or some kind of extremist. But when I came to, I was really young at that time. I was like 12 to 14. So right that onward, right from that day, I thought that I need to aware all other people, especially at this age. People don't have the conscience to justify everything. They need proper guidance. So right after coming to Canada, I found that this organization, Realize Radicalization, they've been doing a great job by like making the young generation aware. And like, if I have to cut everything in short, I'm just gonna say one thing, that is, do not believe anything blindly. Just go and justify from every angle, and justify from the most neutral point of view if you have to uh, go through the righteous path. And this realized radicalization, this very organization, I posted a blog from my point of view, that if you have to become a perfect one, just do not follow any extremism. Just lead a very peaceful life. No one's gonna harm you. And these loners and these backward ideologies, just don't go for them. You have a good life to lead. And and every people out there, they're not gonna help you out there, but you have to be very careful when you choose your companions and when you choose whoever you're talking to. Thank you, Dr. Kalsraman, and thank you everyone for giving me an opportunity to talk.
Thank you, Mr. Hussain. I think it's a very broad perspective that he shared with us, and we just appreciate your personal stories being shared with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you once again. And I think Mr. Hussain brought very interesting points: the family support and how to deal with loners, and if there is a support in the family and in the community, I think that is the best way to intervene. Ladies and gentlemen, we have kind of listened to all the panelists today. Now we are on to the question and answer session, and we have some questions from the audiences, and I'll flash it on the screen now. And anyone can jump into to explain or share their insights on these questions. I think somebody wants to know which kind of groups are most active, and second question is related to it. What kind of social media platforms are more popular in terms of extremism and violence in today's world? So I don't know if Mr. Caiden wants to jump in here.
Yeah, from like what I read recently, a lot of the militias in the United States are using Facebook actually primarily, but they were just recently banned from it. But they were using Facebook to meet, and then from there they would kind of go on to smaller platforms. They were using a streaming service called Discord, which I think was some sort of platform for online gaming. Another one is MeWe. It's this social media platform, kind of like chat room, that's apparently very private. And then the one that we were using initially, that Ethan actually found, was Telegram. So through Telegram, we were able to find these thread boards. But in terms of the like the really white supremacist neo-Nazis organizations, they've been really active on Telegram because a lot of it got doxxed. Like a lot of the information of these individuals were let out by members of Antifa, and also I think that the FBI was fairly active on a lot of these forums and infiltrating them. So maybe Ethan, you have some other insights, perhaps.
Yes, thank you, Caiden. So besides Facebook, due to Facebook's amounted pressure that is being on by the public on Facebook due to these groups recruiting on Facebook, we've seen an increase in private messaging on the platforms that Caiden mentioned, as well as Proton Mail is another email method in how they communicate. But what is interesting is that the Boogaloo Boys that Caiden mentioned earlier, there was an article that I read a few months ago about them recruiting on TikTok, and it is very easy to do that because it is a foreign-owned company, and so they might not have the same amount of filters for that as American social media giants may have. Another social media thing that we're going to see is the rise in encrypted communications like Telegram. And another one is Signal, which is actually an encrypted SMS app, which will also be further used as well. So we're seeing kind of the blend of encryption from government services that has been turned to civilian use to evade the same mechanisms that are now being used to track not just terrorists, but criminals, financial criminals, narco criminals as well.
Yeah, if I may add to that too, I totally forgot about that. But yeah, TikTok was actually pretty massive. So apparently there's around 2 million sort of hits or insights to these videos containing the hashtag Boogaloo, right? So there's kids as young as 16 talking about it. And I don't know if it's more of a joking manner or if it's serious, but the fact that kids as young as 15 and 16 are actually talking about this is pretty alarming, right? Because that means that these groups are having some sort of effect. And the most interesting thing about these groups is they sort of communicate through memes and like jokes. So you never know if it's really serious or if it isn't, but it sort of begins at this initial stage of memes and just kind of outrageous humor. And then it goes on to more of like the sort of intense sort of extremist ideology. But yeah, that TikTok one is actually quite huge. And yeah, like what Ethan said too, like Proton Mail is what the actual organizations use to communicate while planning and meeting because it's fully encrypted, while Telegram itself is more of the propaganda wing. So
Fantastic. So next question is about the one audience wants to know: is there any qualitative differences amongst these groups between Canada and US? Because we know that most of the groups have their roots in Europe, or I mean, white supremacist movements. So anyone can jump in if you have any insights on these.
I'll jump in on that. So I find that these groups in Canada and the US, they don't really view that there is a border in the US, but they have more of the view of establishing an ethno-state for white supremacists in the United States. And based on what they talk about in their forms, they want to form this ethno-state in like the Pacific Northwest or somewhere where there's a lot of forests and a mountainous terrain. But that is definitely, there isn't really any difference because many of the recruits, such as Patrick Matthews, they sought refuge in the United States and they recruited cross-border and did many training exercises cross-border in the United States and in Canada.
yeah, absolutely. I think there really isn't a whole lot of differences in terms of numbers. What you would see in Canada is going to be on a much smaller scale than the United States. I mean, I think there was the estimate that there was around 70 individuals in the Canadian forces that kind of had ties to these extremist groups. But in the United States, you would obviously assume it's a much higher number. And a lot of these groups too are based in the US with chapters in Canada. So I think that's probably due to the differences in our societies kind of politically. I think Canada itself is a less polarized society than the United States, but we are not completely immune to it as well. Yeah.
Mr. Vaughan, do you want to add some points on these social media online platforms, and particularly we are also interested to know because a large group, as Mr. Caiden just mentioned, are being recruited from law enforcement agencies, both in US and Canada. So and including, I mean, we can just mention the latest one that happened in Rideau Hall, a reservist ramming the gate and all. So just given these things, Mr. Vaughan, do you want to add some points with your colleagues?
Yeah, I suppose like as Caiden said, Canada's it's different from the U.S. in that we're not really as polarized, but I suppose the situation in the United States is a lot more intense, and we see that with like the BLM protests and with a lot of white nationalist groups out there, and just with like with President Trump, he's enabling these groups, making comments that don't particularly condone them or anything. And with Canada, it's, of course, the Liberal government as well, and so in that they're also different. Yeah, I suppose that's one of the other factors that contribute to those differences.
Thank you. So last two questions that I will take just to be conscious about time. So I think this is very important. What do you think about interventions? And I'm sure that those who are listening today, please visit these groups' website, realizeradicalization.org, and it is right in the top left corner of CRRIC's website. So just for easy navigation, and CRRIC supports this group and hosts this group. So just visit their site. You will see this group has gone to numerous schools in Winnipeg and interacted with young people, and this was part of sharing ideas on things. So, in general, I just want to listen from each of you, if you may. What do you think one of the best methods of interventions to counter extremism in today's context?
Yeah, I think the sort of best intervention is that personal, or sorry, person to person sort of interaction. So kind of what we see in the US with a guy like Christian Pistiolini, or in Canada with a guy like Brad Galloway, who, former members of these movements, extremist movements, who kind of get into contact with people who are becoming radicalized and members. Because if you're able to share that same sort of, memory and sort of, not ideal set, but they were individuals who went through that radicalization process too, and they were individuals who were exploited by these groups. So I think when you hear from someone who's a former, that kind of makes a big difference. Like I can talk about this to someone who might be having radical thoughts, but I still can't really emphasize with it because I've never been radicalized myself. So I think the greatest sort of tool for intervention, of course, is prevention through education initially. But if someone is radicalized, it's putting them in contact with someone who could very well be seen as an expert on the field. And usually, in more cases than not, that's people who are former members.
Thank you. Mr. Ethan?
Well, I agree mostly with what Caiden advocates for. I'm a big proponent of education in the school system throughout both countries, Canada, US, and this is being done in Europe, in France mostly, but that's what we are advocating for, is more of a French style system in education, especially with the children of returning extremists from places like Syria, and as well as the children of extremists who are going to be born in the US due to the political instability that is going on in the United States south of Canada.
Mr. Vaughan, please.
I'll just add that we can talk about like individual intervention, but also like perhaps like institutional. And so what I mean by that is attempting to implement a certain amount of education in the educational institutions regarding terrorism. And so as we have come in contact with what was her name?
Jennifer Muir.
Yeah, the teacher of Aaron Driver.
Yeah.
And other like other politicians as well, with Dougal Lamont and others, trying to bring awareness to them that, hey, this is an actual problem especially for people who are, particularly for youth, and especially for those who are feeling lonely and whatnot. Getting this education out to these people, definitely the best way to go.
Mr. Hussein, you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. This whole thing is a mental sickness, right? We all know that. So what I would just want to say that this group of community, they're just gonna be targeting the social medias to get to reach people. So the awareness, it has to be risen within the social media in order to prevent it. So we have to make people more and more liberal in thoughts and ideas. I'm just gonna say that we have to just give up all sorts of primitive ideas that we have to carry. We just gotta live that. We shouldn't just stick to our legacy. So what we have to do, we have to work it out what is right. We have to tell our children that if you want a peaceful world, just talk to your parents. And the thing is that what really makes me proud is the generation is becoming more and more liberal, and at the same time we just gotta take care of ourselves that we don't fall prey to any of this extremist group, and we do not fall prey to this their sweet words, because uh, these words might be sweet now, but in the long run it's gonna be the worst thing, or the worst case of scenario that's gonna make you suffer. So do not fall to anything, and do not believe anything blindly unless you just justify. And for this and to justify, you just gotta educate yourself to the fullest, like everyone's been saying. I will agree to everyone in this. Thank you, Dr. Kalsraman.
Thank you. Dear audience, we are just at the end of our session today, as promised, and you've heard some of our participants, and I am always impressed with this group because they bring a lot of new ideas onto the table. And dear audience, just to share with you, Conflict and Resilience Research Institute is very proud to host Realize Radicalization Group within its platform. And if you want to be in touch with them, please visit the website. You have their contact address. And this group is working very hard, I would say. And most interestingly, we all are from Winnipeg, and there's a general assumption that Winnipeg, Manitoba is a hinterland, nothing happens here. And this is how, at least I have witnessed kind of sentiment in the East and West. So actually, you have heard them how the social context is changing and what is changing, and there is no border. And I'm just quoting here from Mr. Ethan's comments that the supremacist groups are trying to create ethno states, and there is no border actually. And this is the prime example of Ryan Thorpe's investigative, piece exposing the bases operation here. So we are trying our best to raise awareness, and most probably within next couple of months we would be starting a project, and Realize Radicalization group is very much involved in this project as well. And the key objective of this project is to educate the teachers or the educators so that they can be better equipped to deal with the changing environment in their schools. Uh, just to conclude today's session, let me just read a couple of lines from one of our works that was published in 2018. And in that research project, I worked with some of the academics from the US, and we studied many projects in 8 Western nations. And we just realized that radicalization is often described by experts as nonlinear, and researchers emphasize that it is difficult, if not impossible, to predict who will become radicalized. And you have heard all our panelists today, they have said that this is really complicated socio-psychological process. Nonetheless, the question about what drives individuals or groups to carry out acts of violence is not new. Violence is not new in human society, and one that many have tried to address, of course. Ancient Greek historian, for example, Thucydides, claimed that people go to war for actually 3 reasons: honor, fear, and interest. These motivations intertwine with political realities. As historian and criminologist Andre Gerolimatos suggests, Islamist terrorist groups employ a number of themes to gain recruits and justify acts of violence against the nation states and its allies. For example, historic injustices perpetrated by the West, a belief that returning to what the terrorists imagine were the precepts of Islam in the time of the Prophet, and finally the European colonialism. So these things are consistent, elements of propaganda used, deployed by all these groups. And dear audience, you also might be intrigued by just learning that both these groups alt-right, white supremacist, and right-wing extremist groups, and these IS and IS followers, they have some commonalities, and there are many researches being undertaken and still ongoing, just to showcase that how they use same type of ideological network to recruit people towards their causes. And I think this is important to note that we have to and accommodate and devise innovative ways of intervention of extremism, because our very existence depends on it. As one of the panelists rightly mentioned, that the society is highly polarized, and what COVID-19, the pandemic, has actually triggered is extreme polarization in terms of social inequality. So this is going to stay for some time, as we all know. And today's session is one of the attempts to, keep the dialogue open amongst young people and adults alike, so that we understand the menace of extremism and violence. So thank you very much, dear panelists, and for your time and energy. And we hope to have another episode, maybe in the future, inviting the rest of the members of this group. And as I said, please tune in and follow this group in their social media. They are doing a wonderful job, and I always appreciate their energy and interest. And thank you very much once again. Have a nice rest of the day. Stay well and stay safe wherever you are. Goodbye.